We had over 13 million acres burned in California. It's more than double the acreage burned in the prior 20 years. And climatologists in particular point out that this is an inevitable response to climate change and it represents the new normal. But I think we need to take a closer look at what happened in 2020 and evaluate it in the context of what's happening throughout the state. 2020, the Urban Dictionary, I love it, defines it as hell. We had over 4 million acres burned in California, surpassing any previous year by threefold. So it was a huge fire year. I think of the 2020 fire season as the perfect storm, particularly for the northern part of the state, because it represented the nexus of a number of critical elements: low rainfall in the north, extraordinary lightning storm, long intense heat wave, fire suppression in forests for over a century, resulting in many times greater fuel load than would have been naturally present. And then we've had this long drought in the state, lasting anywhere from 3 to 7 years, depending on where you are in the state. Any one of these things may not by themselves be unique, but together they represent conditions that led to this massive fire experience we saw this year. Now, one of the things we saw were lots of big fires. This is a chart that just shows fire size, and it's a log scale. So for those who are not familiar with using log scales, this bottom axis, this is just large fires. Bottom axis represents, this is a mistake here. This should be 25,000, whoops. This lower axis, this lower limit here represents 10,000 hectares or 25,000 acres. This line here represents fires that are over 250,000 acres in size. And you can see in 2000 or 2020 and prior years, we had some really massive fires, a number over 250,000 acres in size. But one of the things I want to draw attention to is this is not a unique phenomenon in the state. We have had big fires in the past. This is a paper that I'm working on right now with my co-author, Alex Seifert, going all the way back to 1860, looking at large fires. And we had fires on the order of hundreds of thousands of acres back in the 19th century. So we have had big fires. That in itself is not unique, but certainly we've had a lot of them in recent years, which is, I think, characteristic of the current environment. Now, most of what you read about fires in the media is really focused on forest in the northern part of the state. So I think it's important to point out how different forests are in the north from Southern California. This is a map of the state, represents a huge latitudinal range. In the Western US, it's equivalent from New Mexico all the way to Wyoming. And it represents very different ecosystems. Northern California dominated by forests, Southern California dominated by chaparral. And they've had very different fire histories. For example, the blue area here represents the Sierra Nevada and Northern California forests. And the blue represents the departure from what we believe the historical fire return interval was. And the blue indicates these areas have missed fires in the last 100 years. And this is largely due to fire suppression. It's illustrated in these studies that have been done throughout the West called fire scar dendrochronology records. Each one of these lines, horizontal lines, represents a tree. Each of these vertical lines here represents a fire. And basically what we have seen in these fire scar records is frequent fires in the Sierra Nevada forests up until this point here. And unfortunately, the axis got cut off. This is about 1900. And since 1900, we've had no more fires. And that's because this landscape burned with low intensity surface fires, easy to put out. Foresters have been able to exclude fires from those forests. But contrast that with Southern California, And here it's all, these forests are all marked in yellow and orange, indicating they've had way more fire than historically was the case. And this is illustrated just by written records that document the area burned each decade in, this is for LA County here, each decade since 1910. And basically there hasn't been any shortage of fire over the last century in Southern California. And that's because these landscapes burn very readily. Now, the century of fire suppression that we see in this blue zone here in the northern part of the state has resulted in very different types of fires, what I call fuel dominated fires. And that is what drives these fires is the accumulation of fuels. And this is illustrated in this figure here. This is a fire occurred here in the northeastern part of the state in 2012 called the Rush Fire. And the slashed area is the interior of the perimeter of that fire. The colored areas indicate prior fires. And what's noticeable about this is there was almost no prior fires. In other words, about 90% of this landscape had never burned since 1910, indicating a vast accumulation of fuels. So these fires that occur in the Sierras and northern part of the state, this area here, these are fuel dominated fires, and they're driven by very successful fire suppression. Now let's look at Southern California here. We tend to have fires driven by these Santa Ana wind events. And due to the high population density, about 10 times higher than the northern part of the state, we have excessive human ignitions. Fuel is not an issue because we have so many fires that the landscape gets burned and reburned repeatedly. And this illustrates the same sort of fire perimeter history map as shown above for this Rush Fire. This is the Woolsey Fire. And you'll notice almost nothing within the perimeter of that fire is uncolored. In other words, everything is burned in the past, and some of them repeatedly and some of them very recently. So in other words, there's not a fuel accumulation problem in Southern California. This is not our problem. These are wind dominated fires. Now, in terms of climate, a lot of people talk about the role of climate change. It's really important to realize climate is important when it comes to fire, but it's very different depending on where you are in the state. This is a study we did a few years ago where we looked at the mean temperature in winter, spring, summer, and autumn for the Sierra Nevada. And then we related that to the area burned in that given year. And this is about 100 years of data here. And what we see is in the Sierra Nevada, when we have warmer summers and warmer springs, we get more area burned. We look at the South Coast region, which dominated by chaparral, we don't see any relationship. In other words, it's hot enough and dry enough all the time for a big fire in our part of the world. So climate isn't as big a driver. For example, the main fire or the biggest fires in the Sierra Nevada occur when summer temperatures are about 19 degrees centigrade. In Southern California in summer, that's the lowest temperature we even see. So we always have it hot enough and dry enough. So the annual variation in climate doesn't seem to be important in driving fires. And that has a lot to say about the role of climate change. It's going to have a big role in the Sierra Nevada, probably less role in Southern California. And this is just some multivariate models where we've looked at all the different climate parameters, winter, spring, summer, autumn temperature and precipitation, and tried to find out what drives fires in the Sierra Nevada. And one of the interesting things we find is in the first part of the record, 1910 to 1959, precipitation seems to be the main driver. In the last 50 years, it's temperature in the spring and summer. And if you know the spring and summer temperature in the Sierra Nevada, you can predict within 50% variability the amount of area burned in a given year. In the South Coast, across the entire period of record, we have no relationship with any of these parameters. In short, the seasonal climate doesn't seem to be an important driver of fires in the southern part of the state because the climate is always hot enough and dry enough. And in addition, there are other things that really determine fires. Now, one of the factors that's really important are droughts. And this is a Palmer Drought Severity Index. And this 0 line here indicates all the areas above 0 represent moist years. Everything below represents dry years. And this is a diagram just at the gray dots here for the years from 2012 to 2017. You can see Southern California had a severe drought. That almost certainly is a factor in our fires. In the Sierras, we know it's been a factor in dieback of trees. This is a view outside my back door of Case Mountain. These are all ponderosa trees that died in the 2012 to 2015 drought, and almost certainly are a factor in why fires were so severe this year in the Sierra Nevada. We have the same thing though in Southern California. This is the Santa Monica Mountains during this drought. This is all, the gray is all dieback of chaparral. And we've actually quantified this using remote sensing. And this is the Woolsey fire outline. And all of this red indicates dieback that we've documented within the perimeter of that fire. So the dieback due to this extraordinary drought was almost certainly a factor. One thing that we might just point out is we can pick out fires in the state which we can describe as fuel dominated versus wind dominated. The fuel dominated ones tend to be mostly in the Sierra Nevada, heavily concentrated in lightning ignited fires. Seldom do people die and seldom do we lose many structures. Contrast that with wind dominated fires, mostly in coastal California, both Southern California as well as Northern California, Napa, Sonoma area. One of the interesting things is these are never ignited by lightning. 100% of our wind dominated fires are started by people, and either intentionally through arson or through power line failures. And these are also the fires where most people die and most structures are lost. Now, what are the solutions to these? I'm just going to briefly mention what we know about the fuel dominated fires here in the Sierra Nevada, and that is they require investments in prescription burning and other treatments. And there's a huge amount of money now going into doing these treatments. And this is just an illustration of the long history in the Sierras of doing prescription burning. This is Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. They started prescribed burning in 1968, and they've been doing it continuously. And we've just recently evaluated the amount of burning from this prescription burning program. This is really the solution in the northern part of the state. But the important thing that we need to understand is not the solution for Southern California. Now, Southern California, we have these wind-driven fires, Santa Ana winds in Southern California. Same thing in the northern part of the state, north winds, or some people call them Diablo winds. This is our real problem. It requires a totally different solution. One of the things to note about these fires that are driven by Santa Ana winds, which is what SAW stands for. This is the red. This is when we get area burn from Santa Ana winds on a Julian calendar. And in other words, day 1 is January 1st. This is 365 is the end of the month or the year. Most of our Santa Ana winds occur here, or wind-driven fires occur here in the autumn. Now, the reason they occur in the autumn is that's when we get the most severe Santa Ana winds. This is just the distribution of Santa Ana winds throughout the year. Typically, they start in September, although in the last few decades, we found fewer and fewer in September and more in October, November, and December. And the reason these winds are so critical is it comes at the end of our normal annual drought. This diagram here is a climate diagram. The dots represent drought. The Santa Ana winds occur at the end of our drought season. And so the conditions are the worst possible in terms of fuel conditions when the winds hit. Now, the solution for Southern California is what I call the 5 Ps of wind-dominated fires. And number 1 is people. This is more a people problem than a fuel problem. 100% of these fires are started by people. And this is important to recognize because where people live and what they do greatly affects the losses from these fires. For example, This is from the Santa Rosa, up in Sonoma County, Press Democrat, talking about the dry winds posing incredible fire threats in the northern part of the state. This article was from 1964. It's important to realize they've had these big fires for a long period of time. And what's interesting is in 2017, we had this Tubbs fire. 22 people died, 5,600 structures lost. And it's represented by this black outline here and goes all the way down. Here's the town of Santa Rosa. What's interesting is in 1964, 50 years earlier, we had a fire that burned almost the same perimeter, and it was driven by Santa Ana winds. But what was interesting, in 1964, there were no fatalities and only 100 structures lost. Certainly part of the reason for this is the change in demography and population growth. There were many fewer people in 1964, 30,000 people in Santa Rosa in 1964, whereas in 2017, it was 170,000 people. So population growth is almost certainly one of our biggest drivers of why these fires are so much worse in terms of losses of lives and structures. And this is illustrated here by development patterns. This is the 1964 Hanley fire. The town of Santa Rosa is down here. And this pink line shows the outline of the fire. And the dark color here indicates dense housing. The light colored tan represents low density housing. Compare that with the 2017 Tubbs fire perimeter, you can see the vast expanse of low density housing. And so when you look at this diagram and you see nobody died, in this diagram 22 people died, that's part of the reason. The people have expanded out into these watersheds of fairly dangerous fuels. But not only have we put more people at risk, we've also increased the chances of a fire even ignited, because all these wind-dominated fires are started by people. Put more people on the landscape, you get more fires. And this is illustrated here by some data we just recently collected looking at Santa Ana winds in Southern California. This we get in Southern California, we've looked at 71 years of data. We get on average about 20 to 40 days of Santa Ana winds every year in Southern California. We've classified those days of Santa Ana winds. Actually, these are wind events. So we're looking at contiguous days of Santa Ana winds and ask, during those wind events, how much area burned? What we see is over 70% of the Santa Ana winds have nothing burned at all. In other words, what determines how much area burns is not the climate, and it's not necessarily the winds. It's whether or not somebody starts a fire. In fact, we've done models where we've tried to predict for each month in Southern California, October, November, December, January, and trying to predict how much area burns, which is log hectares here. And the number one driver is whether the number of ignitions of fires during the Santa Ana wind event. In other words, these are people-driven events. Now, it doesn't mean other things aren't important. For example, the maximum wind speed during a Santa Ana wind event is also a significant factor. And we've also found, at least for October, the prior 5-year drought is a factor. So a number of things go into this, but in all months, the dominant driver is the numbers of ignitions during a Santa Ana wind event. So this is a people problem, and we need to recognize that people are at the root of this problem. And this is important because we've seen this more than doubling of area burn since the year 2000. And climatologists will attribute this to an approximately 0.4 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. But they're not thinking about the fact that these Santa Ana wind-driven fires are all due to human ignitions, and people have grown phenomenally in that same 20-year period. We've added 6 million more people to the state of California since the year 2000. We are continually growing at the rate of 300,000 people a year in the state. And Southern California is bearing much of this. For example, since the year 2000, Riverside County has increased its population by 35%. That's a phenomenal rate of growth. So we're putting more people on the landscape. This increases ignition sources. It increases the number of people at risk. And what's important to understand is the rate at which we are now growing, 300,000 people a year, in a relatively short period of time, 30 years, we're going to go from presently around 40 million people to 60 million people. These problems are only going to get worse because the population is growing at a rate and it doesn't seem to stop. And until we figure out how to deal with that problem, we're likely to continue to see fire problems. Now, of the 5 Ps of these wind-dominated fires, the second P that I think is important, we recognize people are the issue, fuels are not the issue. The real issue is prevention. How do we stop people from starting fires? So rather than focusing on fuel treatments, which we now see state and federal government want to do this in the Sierra Nevada, which is where it's appropriate. They now want to do this in Southern California, where it's probably not going to change anything. We need to change the emphasis from fuel treatments to fire prevention. And it's not just a numbers issue. We've actually seen in California since the mid-1980s, excuse me, we've actually seen a decrease in numbers of ignitions. But what has changed is the source of those ignitions. There's been a shift towards more and more fires caused by power line failures. And this is illustrated by some data that we've just recently put together, where we've looked at Santa Ana wind events over the last 71 years, and we've asked what were the causes of those for the first 50 or the first half of this record, 1948 to 83 versus 84 to 2018. And so the red indicates the most recent. And the number one thing to recognize throughout this period, lightning is never a source of it. It's all due to people either intentionally like arson or due to power line failures. And this inset here shows a blow up of the short-term changes in source of fires from the 1970s up to the present. And what we see is arson in the late 20th century was an important source of fires, but it's greatly declined in the last couple decades. It's been replaced by power line failures. This is the number one issue we need to be thinking about. How do we solve power line ignited fires? Because since the year 2000, we've had 224,000 hectares burned from power line ignited fires. That's 5 times greater than the previous 20 years. It is getting worse. And the causes, as I mentioned before, I think part of it has to do to demographic changes. For example, the 1964 population growth in Santa Rosa versus 2017, as it expands out into these wildland interface or wildland areas, you have an increase in the electrical grid, an increase in distribution lines, an increase in opportunities for failures like this. But there's also the factor of poor maintenance. And so the solutions, we need to certainly address population growth. And that means we need to address how do we grow populations or not grow them in ways that are going to affect ignitions of wildland fires. But we also need to improve the maintenance of power lines. And then there's also this program that was initially started by San Diego Gas and Electric, and now it's been taken on by the Pacific Gas and Electric in the northern part of the state, what they call the PSPS program. PSPS stands for Public Safety Power Shutdown Program. Basically, what these power companies have done, and it's best illustrated in San Diego, they have now over 200 weather stations distributed on their power lines throughout the county of San Diego, and they monitor it in real time. And their plan is when the wind conditions are severe, they shut off the power to those people. Now, it's potentially a solution, but probably not the long-term solution if we can solve these other issues related to population growth and improving maintenance. But the important thing about the public safety power shutdown, in my view, is prior to this program, the only people who really thought about these fires were people who lived at the interface. Now, when 100,000 people in the North Bay area of San Francisco have their power shut off, there's a lot more people thinking about fire. So it's certainly a way of advertising fire. Now, number 3 in this 5 Ps is planning. We need to think about community planning that recognizes fire hazards. And I'm anxious to hear what our state senator has to say about these issues, because this is really something that we can effect change. The way to think about it is we have always planned in terms of avoiding housing developments in areas subject to earthquakes and floods. But we haven't done the same thing with fire, in part because there's always been the understanding that state and federal firefighters will stop fires from reaching urban environments. We now know that's not the case. And we now need to think about what some people refer to as fire zoning. And another approach to all this is to think in terms of broader regional planning rather than community planning on a local scale. Because in order to plan for fire, we need to think broadly in terms of what's going on in the region. This is just an illustration. Of course, those of you who live in Southern California know all about this, urban sprawl. There are ways to change the way you develop, though, that affect the hazard. For example, this is some modeling that Alex Seifert and myself and other colleagues did a number of years ago, where we predicted the risk in terms of housing loss due to different types of development. This blue line represents what we would call infill. In other words, you put in houses within areas already developed, you infill. Another is just expand outward from the wildland urban interface. And then there's also the leapfrog approach, where you put a development far beyond the current wildland urban interface. And there's no question the leapfrog approach results in much greater risk of housing losses. So there are things we can do in terms of community planning that could affect fire losses. Number 4, protection. We have emphasized that fuels are not the issue in Southern California, but the one thing I should emphasize is fuels are important when they're near homes. So it's incorrect to think that fuels per se are not at all important. They're important near homes. So the greatest effort in terms of fuel treatment needs to be focused on the effort near homes, and less so as you move into the wildlands. Currently, the state, at least most counties in the state, require reducing fuels within 100 feet of homes. This may not be enough because most homes burn from embers. There are some people who maintain this, that we need more than 100-foot clearance. For example, this is an illustration from Ramona in San Diego County of like a 300-foot clearance zone. This is probably more than what you need to protect your homes. And it has a lot of negative effects. Yeah. More clearance means greater chance of erosion. You get invasive grasses fill in this denuded area, and they are highly flammable. And then you also just lose natural resources. For example, we did a calculation for San Diego County that if everybody at the wildland urban interface increased their clearance from 100 feet to 300 feet, we would lose approximately 15% of our natural resources in the county. So this is an important issue to resolve. We need to have good reason why we would want to do 300 feet. And the science doesn't support it. This is a study we did a number of years ago where we looked at the proportion of homes destroyed. And there's no question, if you only have a clearance of 25 feet, you're much more likely to lose your home. But beyond about 100 feet, we see no change in probability of a house being lost. So this excessive clearance of 300 feet at the present time isn't justified. We need science to justify if we are going to sacrifice this level of resources by having a 300-foot clearance. The other thing to recognize is most of our homes don't burn because the fire burns right up to the house and ignites it. They mostly burn from embers, and those embers end up landing on litter on the tops of roofs. And so certainly there are things we can do to reduce the flammability of your house by reducing litter accumulation. In fact, we did a study a number of years ago where we looked at homes that were burned at the interface versus homes that were unburned. And we calculated a number of things based on Google Earth images prior to the fire. We calculated how much clearance there was around the house, how much tree canopy there was overlapping the house, the tree ground surface in the yard, the amount of patio decks base. And the bottom line is the only thing that turned out to be important was tree canopy overlap. The more tree canopy overlap you had on your house, the greater chance your house would burn. And it was highly significant. And we don't believe this is because the tree itself ignites the house. It's because the tree drops litter on the roof, and it's that litter that ignites and the embers are blown in. And this ember cast is extremely important. Here's a fire from Carlsbad several years ago. This is a house here, well separated from the wildland area here where it burned. There's a big wall. This area here didn't burn at all, yet the house was totally destroyed. It was destroyed because embers were cast across this area onto the house and ignited. So the ember cast is what we need to be concerned about. And what that tells us is we can harden our houses in ways to reduce their probability of being burned. The other thing to keep in mind is defensible space around homes. Firefighters will tell you this is really important, but the type of defensible space is really important. For example, clearance doesn't really mean clearing everything around the house. And one of the downsides, and this is a picture from Paradise that burned up in the campfire a couple of years ago. And this home that's back in here, totally destroyed. This is the clearance around that home, total clearance. Now, that clearance didn't help them at all. And that's partly because the homes burned through ember cast that was blown with high winds across this landscape. And when you clear all the vegetation away, you actually increase the laminar flow of embers across the landscape. You increase the chances of those homes burning. There are reasons for keeping trees on your landscape because they may act as what we've described as ember catchers. And this is an example of a home here in Paradise. This is a gentleman here I visited. His home survived, and one of the things, and none of the homes around him did not survive. His home was surrounded by trees, all these green trees. And if you look through here, this is his neighbor's homes, they all burned down. Certainly one of the factors that could have affected why his home didn't burn is these trees basically being green, they don't ignite when the embers hit them, but yet they stop the embers from hitting the house. And so we need to think in terms of clearance. It doesn't necessarily help to clear everything off the landscape. And trees, particularly well-watered green trees, can be of value in terms of catching embers. And this is illustrated by a photo from the Paradise fire. That town was pretty much destroyed. This is a section of Paradise that was burned up. There are a few homes here that survived the fire, but everything else was destroyed. What's interesting is it was surrounded by green forest. In other words, the fire didn't burn up and destroy the town of Paradise. It was embers being blown onto the town, and the trees didn't burn because the trees actually have access to underground water, so they're moist. The homes, they represent dead fuels. Houses have nothing but dead wood in them. And one of the interesting things is the winds were blowing from the east here, and it's quite possible that these trees actually acted as ember catchers in a way by diffusing the embers over these houses near the edge onto the rest of the community, because these houses mostly survived. So it's important to recognize when we talk about clearance, it's not a simple matter of getting rid of everything, and some vegetation can actually be helpful. The other thing to recognize is there are things you can do about your house that can change the probability of burning. This is a study we did a few years ago, and I'll just point out some of the things that are important. The factors that explain most of the variation in terms of whether or not a house survived were things like this blue line here, which are the eaves on your house, but other things like vent screening and side paneling and window panes are also important. But eaves are critically important. In most regions in the state, we see a significant effect to the types of eaves. And what we're talking about when we describe different types of eaves, this is a common construction pattern. I grew up in a house in Southern California that had open eaves like this. A lot of homes today, in the home I live in now, the contractor insisted on what they call closed eaves. This seems to have a big impact on whether or not a home survives. Open eaves are much more likely to conduct fire into the attic. And the primary reason is the vents here are facing directly towards the wind. So the wind is blowing embers directly into the attic. Closed eaves, on the other hand, the vents are facing towards the ground. And that almost certainly is one of the reasons why closed eaves result in fewer housing losses than open eaves. And then of course, just the mesh size of the vents here can have effects, double pane windows, another thing. The last issue I might mention is rooftop sprinklers. Some people are adamant that this is the way to solve your problems with homes. That is, put sprinklers on your roof. And there's a lot of problems with this, but there are potential solutions. But I think one of the biggest problems with sprinklers on the roof is simply the fact that when you have Santa Ana winds blowing at 50 miles per hour, this water is likely to be blown on someone else's house and may not be very effective. If you didn't have high winds, maybe those sprinklers would be more effective. And then the last thing I'll just mention is of the 5 Ps that we need to do better with in terms of dealing with wind-dominated fires, we need better predictions about what fires are doing in real time. In other words, when a fire starts, it's blown by Santa Ana winds. We need good models that'll tell us where it's going to go and when it's going to get there. That is certainly one of the limitations in the Camp Fire that destroyed the town of Paradise, is limited ability to predict what that campfire was going to do, and also limited communication with the public as well as agencies about what the fire was doing. So predictions are certainly an important part of what we need to focus on. So I'll just end it there, but just point out one of the important things to keep in mind in all of this is all the unknowns that we don't really know. And it's illustrated, I think, by the poetry of Donald Rumsfeld. And this is based on a speech he gave in 2002, and which he talked about the unknowns. As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And that's certainly a large part of the fire situation today. There are things that are yet to be discovered that we haven't even figured out, we don't know. So I'll just end it there and happy to answer any questions.
So can you hear me all right, John?
I can hear you.
Great. So I'm going to give you 1 or 2 questions, and then we're going to introduce Henry, and then we'll come back and ask you both some questions. So let's see. Are the high power transmission lines from the desert solar traveling over forest areas to urban areas a significant source of fire?
Well, I can't say that I'm an expert on this, but my understanding is most fires start from the distribution lines, which are the smaller lines that feed electricity to homes. The campfire might be an exception. I've seen the power line that was defective in that fire, and it was not a normal distribution line. So there may be examples, But I wouldn't say that I could speak to that other than say what we generally know is that the distribution lines are the problem.
We also have a question about population growth, saying that actually California hasn't grown that much in the last 20 years. So you were saying it was growing fast. So how do you reconcile that with your numbers?
I would say go to the Census Bureau and look at the statistics. The state is growing at the rate of hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, the last estimate was 300,000 people a year.
Okay, I think the person would disagree with you, but why don't we do this? What I'm going to do is, if I can find Henry here, Henry, you should be now a co-host to the meeting.
I'm here.
And great. And so what I'm going to do is hi there you are, Henry. So what I'm going to do, John, is we're going to introduce Henry. We're going to let him talk for 10 or 15 minutes, whatever he feels like, and then we'll come back and field questions for both of you. How would that be, John?
That'll be fine. I'll be here. I'd love to hear what Henry has to say.
Yes, we can review the 5 Ps of fire prevention with Henry in a minute. Well, I'd like to introduce State Senator Henry Stern, and we'll need you to take your program down, John. State Senator Henry Stern is a 6th generation Californian, which is 4 ahead of me, who represents nearly 1 million residents in the 27th Senate District. It runs south from Santa Clarita through Simi Valley and Calabasas to the Pacific Ocean. He is chair of the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee and a great friend of the Sierra Club. Tonight, we are going to give him 10 minutes, whatever he would like, to give us an introduction to his thoughts about wildfire resiliency and preventing development in high-risk fire areas. And I know he unfortunately went through having his home I believe, burned down in the Woolsey fire. So I'm going to introduce one of our favorite state senators, Henry Stern.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on with Dr. Keeley also. Very affirming presentation. Sometimes you feel like when you're trying to make innovation in wildfire, land use, and climate policy that, nobody's listening, especially when you're not making progress. So it's affirming to hear someone of his esteem talk through this, changing psychology about fires from the outside in to the inside out, and really starting at the home and going outward as a strategy and as a new way of thinking about climate resilience, frankly, at a community scale, is very different, I think, from how we've been approaching fire policy and wildfire policy, for that matter, as well, which is try to go out as deep as you can in the wildlands and stop these things. That acreage targets are the sort of the key, and not so much about homes and properties, but more so about the sort of massive land you can scale with things like culling and fire breaks and cutting down small trees. And the sort of overall trend in this state, I think, is going in a bit of a dangerous direction. And despite all the efforts from this new resources agency and this administration, I still think that they've got some extra work to do. Even if you just look at the MOU we signed with the Trump administration's Forest Service, you see that sort of timber mindset driving a lot of the state's wildfire management policy. And where we look at our ecologies in the South, where I grew up, and a lot of people with the club I know even better than I do, all the peaks and canyons and all those amazing stretches of land, especially through this metropolis of whatever you want to call Los Angeles. You can call Orange County Los Angeles, and for all I'm concerned, spills into Riverside County and way out into the greater Inland Empire. So the Southland in general, and the nature of those fires, and these wind-driven, ember-driven, home-driven fires are very different than the sort of forest fire that Smokey the Bear has been telling us to be afraid of for all these years. So, I got a trial by fire coming into the legislature as a climate change attorney and somebody who's a conservationist, and worked with you all for many years on trying to preserve land and try to prevent unsustainable growth into areas that don't make a lot of sense ecologically, or from, say, a biodiversity perspective or an endangered species perspective. So, when we look at developments in the Santa Clarita Valley and where all the new targets are for the big bedroom communities to meet this alleged housing shortage, the prime land is largely in very high fire severity zones. And so there's a real tendency to want to go to that raw land because it's cheaper and it's easier than doing infill, and do big, large scale 10, 20, 30,000 unit developments, but that happen to be in areas that incur significant risk. And the groundwork we've been trying to lay in building a political consensus for a new way of pursuing land use development and a new way of approaching firefighting as a preventative effort, not as a suppression effort. The new coalition we've been trying to build is to show people who don't live in fire areas how expensive it is for them to continue the patterns we're undergoing. If you live in Compton, you're paying Calabasas's fire bill indirectly through your county taxes and all the other revenues that go towards the suppression budget. There is an inherent subsidy to allowing every new McMansion or subdivision or whatever you want to call it out into very high fire severity zones. Every time you permit one of those, everyone else, all the taxpayers in the region are taking on some sunk costs to get your infrastructure there, to get your power there, your water, the road, let alone the fire budget. And people are subsidizing it with their life, even with the risk the firefighters are taking on. And so we're trying to take on two mighty tasks this session. One is to get some concrete land use reforms in place and try to get a toehold in this housing conversation that at least takes certain land off the table. We have a bill right now, SB 55, that I sort of reintroduced from last year, which is very aggressive posture. It's a straight moratorium on new development in very high fire severity zones. I'm not particularly optimistic right now about the chances. The building industry is ready to go to battle on this, as are the building trades, and we've got a very uphill climb when it comes to limiting development. And I think you may have seen, those of you who get in the weeds of this, may have seen the governor veto a couple even modest bills around restricting development in fire zones in the past year or two. Friedman bill and a Hannah-Beth Jackson bill last year that I joint authored with both of them. I try to, play a fair amount of team ball here, but I've been hammering on the governor as much as possible to try to get him to understand that, especially in the Southland, our ecologies are different and our firefighting approach has got to be different. And it's got to start with community hardening, and it can't start in trying to treat chaparral like timber. And they've seen this from lawsuits that have come their way over the vegetation treatment plan they've pursued. The bulk of dollars for wildfire prevention, I think 90%, 95% by some estimates, have gone towards the sort of big tree projects, if you will, and zero has gone to home hardening or community hardening. You might consider maybe a little allocation for backup power we put out for a few years, because PSPS is certainly part of this and all the power outages and all the issues that entails. But that money was burnt on diesel generators for a lot of local governments to go purchase, furthering the climate problem. So I think we're tip of the spear in this district. I mean, you look, I've got Simi Valley and the whole Santa Susana range there through all the way out into Santa Clarita, and then the Santa Monica Mountains range as well. So we've had fire after fire after fire. I mean, I came into office on the heels of Thomas, went through Woolsey, but Woolsey and Hill and Saddle Ridge though, and Rye, and we've been through it in a very diverse range. Skirball and all the sort of San Fernando Valley 405 corridor fires. So we're spending billions of dollars fighting these things. We're losing life and property, and I think we've got to stop building towards that risk and put some new impediments in place, at least some kind of enforceable guideline structure. So if I can't get if I can't get traction on this moratorium and we've got a shot. I'm working on it right now, but we're going to need help on that. But if we can't get a hard stop, I think we're going to need some kind of enforceable, beyond a building standard, a sort of fire planning standard, and to work that really into the CEQA process, into the general planning process, into the local government process, so that, say, the OPR guidelines, and again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but the governor's office has an office of planning, and they develop guidelines for local governments to use to analyze projects going forward. And they've just put out a guidance about how to plan a community in a fire resilient manner. That's everything from having the right 0 to 5 foot vegetation treatment plans right around your home, to having sort of collectively enforced building standards, and the kind of eave and vent and mesh management, all those simple little things, but all the way to evacuation planning and collective modeling and some other sort of key emergency response issues around power. So they put it all out there, but it's all optional right now. And a developer doesn't have to adhere to that. They can take it into advisement, and they can tell you their development's green, but we really don't have a lot of hard stops there standing in the way. When you look at Tejon, when you look at Newhall, or even little ones all up through the LA canyons and corridors, it's coming. That land is valuable. Those of you who live in the hillsides know it's beautiful. It's also dangerous, and they're sort of proportional in a strange way. So we'll see what kind of traction we can make on the land use restriction. But the other front, in terms of funding resilience and really taking the mantle, we're going to try to scale a hardening program very quickly here. There's $100 million between federal and state money in the budget right now, and we're fighting for more of it. That's sensitive to fire ecologies, that avoids tight conversion, that isn't just a prescribed fire cull and cut approach to wildfire management, but starts at the communities and goes out. And that's going to be about also wrangling the insurance industry into the mix and getting them to provide incentives and discounts to homeowners who are undertaking these measures if they can certify some kind of collective action. But it's also going to take some state and public dollars. So we're running the climate change bond again. It failed last year in the assembly. We tried to get it on the 2020 ballot. The polling is still through the roof. People know we got to fight COVID and climate at the same time. Can't just pretend one crisis isn't happening. So voters want it, but we haven't had the political will. The assembly stopped the bond last year, and it was frankly too small. It was $5.5 billion. I mean, fire alone is a $100 billion problem right now. Add on flood and sea level rise and drought and all the other sort of climate risks we're facing, and you're looking at $1 trillion liability between now and 2050. That's enough to bankrupt the state of California. And so I'm hoping that fiscal reality allows us to pump up the size of the bond, to improve some of the wildfire components, and hopefully get some money moving both in the near term and the long term. I don't think it's going to take that much, but I think we need some kind of incentive structure to start promoting the collective action, either through fire safe councils or resilience corps, or ways to show people that the California state government has your back when it comes to this work. So I actually think it's a way to put tens of thousands of people to work. I think it's the number one most job intensive greenhouse gas reducer. When you look at proper fire resiliency management, is very hands-on. It is very people-centric, and it's ongoing. It's maintenance, right? It's people out there working with their hands for a long time. And so it's time we stop looking down and say landscape architects, or even the people, raking leaves or trimming brush, and start treating them like climate warriors like they are. So we can get into some more detail, but I think there's some very real threats to our environment and to fire risk in this coming year. And hopefully we can create a bit of a beachhead with my committee in the Senate, and maybe along with environmental quality, Senator Allen, who's been a really good partner here. He and I can create some new political space to pump the brakes a little bit on this race to fire.
Well, thank you, Henry. I'm going to alternate between trying to recognize people I know and unmuting them, and also reading questions that people have submitted before. So pardon me if you've, go ahead, Henry.
No, please. No, go for
Yeah.
it. That sounds.
So let me see, where are you? Let's see, I think I can find, Gina, well, there you are. You've got one question. Let me unmute you. I'm trying to unmute you.
Here,
Right.
I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
Hey there. Hi, everybody. Hi, Henry.
Welcome back. I know you've been back a while, but welcome back to our part of the world.
I know. It's been like 18 years since I was part of the Forest Task Force. So, Senator Stern, it's great to see you tonight. So, I'm wondering if you know about the West Hills Crest project, which is being evaluated by the County Department of Regional Planning. It's 58 beautiful, pristine acres, extremely hilly in unincorporated West Hills, west of the city part of West Hills.
Okay.
And they just have, so they want to do 25 large lot luxury single family residences. And it's north of Hidden Hills, south of Las Virgenes Open Space Preserve. I've already submitted a comment on the NOP for the EIR.
Yeah.
I would like my group, Coalition for Valley Neighborhoods, and as many people as possible, including the Sierra Club, to vigorously oppose this harebrained scheme. They want to remove what they want to do is they want to take the hill and take almost 1 million cubic yards of soil. So they want to lop the top off the hill and then dump it into the lower spots and grade it so that they can build these homes. And obviously it's going to affect the drainage to the watershed there, to the headwaters to Malibu Creek, not to mention all kinds of problems with ingress and egress. And it's in the path of the Woolsey fire. So
Gina, what was the name of the development again? I think.
Yeah. West Hills. What?
here, let me give you the project number. So it's called West Hills Crest.
Crest. Okay.
Crest, and the project number is 98123.
Is this in? I get mixed up between which supervisorial district is right on that edge. Is it Huel or Barger?
Huel.
It's still Sheila. Okay.
Yeah, it's west of West Hills. It's the unincorporated part of West Hills. So it's project number 98123. They also want to remove 14 mature oak trees, and they have a permit, oak tree permit number 98123.
Okay.
I can email you, let me know, I can email you everything. But
Yeah, and Jeremy Wolf, my fearless district director and planning expert, may be on here too, but I'll throw my email in the chat.
Also, if you send it to me, Gina, I can send it to them too, since I've got their.
Listen, and Gina, thanks for putting it on my radar. I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would have an ordinance up within LA County right now, and I wouldn't have to even go try to get these votes in the California state legislature. I've lost a few of those fights in the past from the sidelines, so haven't quite been able to compel a broader county ordinance. On the whole, Sheila's been sensitive to this stuff, but we've seen a lot of other sort of just people don't want to hear about the wildfire thing. You know, it's like it's almost too much for them to handle. So it's been frustrating that we don't have a model county ordinance in place right now. I think that would save a lot of people.
Thank you. Gina, we got to move on. Apologize. So let's see. I know we had some other questions, but let's see here. Anyone wave at me? We'll just put you on too if I know you. Okay, Kay. And then I'll go to a question I have. Yes, so.
Am I unmuted?
You are just now unmuted. Go for it.
Okay. Hi. This actual question is for anyone who has an answer for it. My work is mostly in Australia, looking at cultural burning by indigenous groups, where there are ranger groups who are reinstituting cultural burning regimes using the most modern, GPS technology, GIS technology, a lot of modern equipment. And I'm wondering if anything like that is happening in California, especially I assume Northern California.
Yes.
Is Sierra working with any of the tribes?
Let's give that to John. Thank you.
Yeah, there's no question. Native American groups are very active in doing burning projects in Sierra Nevada forests. And the primary reason is those forests have been very successful at excluding fires for over a century, and they need to put fire back into their systems. And the federal and state governments doing it through prescription burning, and they're also working with tribes to use traditional methods to put fire back into the system. So it makes a lot of sense in our forest where we have excluded fires. But when you start looking at Southern California, there really is no role for restoring
Right.
Native American burning practices because we already have way too much fire on the landscape. The influx of Euro-Americans into California in the 1800s now dominates Southern California, and we have more fire than we've ever seen in the past. So we don't need to come up with new ways to put fire into the system. We need to come up with ways to stop fires from burning. And so it's something that is really makes a lot of sense in forest in the northern part of the state. It's probably not something we need to focus on. I have talked in various conferences to tribal groups. And what I've suggested is they might put their thoughts together about how we can deal with this excess of fires in Southern California. What sort of traditional knowledge is there that might help us deal with our contemporary problem of too much fire? But I don't know that there's much history and that's going to contribute to that. So it's something that's relevant to the northern part of the state, probably less so in the southern part of the state.
I agree. And look to the Yurok and the Karuk. Those are the two leading tribes, the Karuk, the Karuk tribe, and the Yurok. They've been the most advanced and are doing some major pilots right now. But that's all way, way, way north. That's like, yeah.
Well, gentlemen, we have a practical question for you. If you're a homeowner near the wild and urban interface, how much would it cost you to modify your home to make it more fire resistant? Go for it, Henry.
I mean, depends is my lawyerly answer, but yeah, you guys can correct me if you see it differently. I mean, there's a difference between having a wraparound wood deck right in the middle of a forested land, and then just trying to get some pavers in, throw some mesh up, get your gutters enmeshed, get your gasketing redone on your garage. I'd say there's a scale of investment that goes somewhere between $0 and $1,000. That is the easy stuff that is very doable. That's Home Depot ready, and then there's some bigger structural elements that may be in a unique sort of home context that end up being bigger and complex and hard to deal with. But for the average homeowner, I don't know what you'd say, doctor, but I think you're in the under $1,000 range. I mean, mesh is cheap, depending on the cost of the services.
I would just offer that there are things that people can do that don't necessarily involve expenditures. One of the number one issues that we need to be thinking about is where we put plantings around the house. We shouldn't have anything growing that is right next to your house. In fact, Jay Lopez with the LA County Fire used to always say, make sure if you plant anything, you can see it from your kitchen window, meaning it's not growing right next to the house, it's out away from the house. And so that's number one thing people could do. There are a lot of homes that have plants growing right up next to the house. You could have a 5-foot border, put in something that is not flammable next to the house and have your plantings away from the house. That can have a lot of impact. The other thing is people often have wooden fences that connect with their house. That's a problem. You need to think about ways to produce fencing next to the house that aren't flammable. There are a lot of these things, and a lot of it is online. There was a website that just came up that was part of an effort that I was involved with, along with a lot of people from Santa Monica Mountains, to produce a website on defensible space around homes. And there's diagrams and lots of information about what you can do. And it doesn't all involve money. If you start hardening your house by changing your eaves from closed to or open to closed, that can be on the order of hundreds of dollars, and changing the mesh size also. There are other things like this sprinkler system people have suggested. There are ways to develop those on the order of $1,000 or less. It requires a solar power and it requires an extra tank. But once again, I'm not sure a lot of people believe that's really going to make a difference in a Santa Ana wind-driven fire. But I really think people need to think seriously about what they do when they do clearances. And that is, you don't want to clear everything around your house. Green trees actually can be valuable.
And hey, I want to hype your own website. You didn't give them the URL. It's defensiblespace.org. Am I right?
That sounds right to me.
Because you did it with RCD and some of the Santa Monica Mountains folks.
Correct.
Yeah. John, for your viewers,
Yes.
it's defensiblespace.org. It's an excellent website. We're sending out a whole mailer now hyping your work there. So
Thank
really
you.
good.
Wendy, did you have a question? If you want to unmute yourself, I'll let you ask it.
I do. I have a question for Henry, and that is, in order to get a foothold into sort of the legislature where they seem to be tone deaf and not seeing that last year was the worst year on record and the costs are huge here, is there a possibility of you and Ben sort of joining together with your local senators in the area and asking for the Southern California area, the Santa Susana and the Santa Monica Mountain Zone, to be exempted from these housing bills? Just as a starting point to get sort of in, and alternatively or mutually, can you start to introduce legislation or talk about mandatory evacuation modeling and roadway capacity analysis? Because we don't have that anywhere in the state of California. And with Paradise, that turned out to be one of the major problems with people. And Woolsey too. And we're not looking at evacuation as a requirement before people can build. We're looking at it after, and that's really tragic for us. Those are my questions.
Really good suggestion is like because I've been fighting. It's funny. I've been dealing with they want CEQA exemptions for all fire road development, and so they were going to just. Their way around the evacuation issue was going to be like, oh, let's just carve out a bunch of take old fire roads and then turn them into main streets in the middle of Topanga and Agoura and all over. And so I'm a little worried about them trying to expedite that kind of road construction. But I think that kind of CEQA amendment could be strong. We put SB 55 out there essentially as a built-in amendment to SB 9 or SB 10 or any of these measures that are coming through. Is if you just tack that on and at least exempt the very high fire severity zones, which would include the entire Santa Monica Mountains area and a lot of Santa Susana Mountains area and the Verdugos and all throughout the Southland, really, you'd have a morally defensible bill here. So we put 55 out there as a way to, like, if they were to hitch that to these sort of mainstream housing bills, it would effectively exempt the mountain areas. So that was our most elegant way of doing it, was just doing it by fire zone. But we are certainly open to other ideas, and we're going to need your help for Southland legislators. Like, it can't just be Ben and I, or we're going to fail at this thing. We got to get motivated members of the state legislature who want to say no to building towards more fire risk. Like, that should be a pretty simple thing. But we got 39 members of the LA delegation, and right now it's too lonely. So maybe it's just trying to go find co-authors or make a concerted push around an amendment, but they fought us off last year. Wiener wouldn't take the amendment, and neither would the pro tem. So that's why I voted against all their bills, but I don't want to be a martyr and just be one or two lone votes on the Senate floor and then for bad things to happen. So I think it's a longer strategy, but you're right to raise it, Wendy, and maybe that's Wendy Sue. It's the EVAC idea is an interesting one. So let me ponder that a little more.
And I need to apologize for Henry. I didn't recognize the term admin as a human being, so I actually didn't let your staffer in. So my apologies. If I'd seen Wolf as his name, I would have let him in right away, but I didn't recognize his name.
He's
so
a good
my
Wolf.
apologies. He's just suffering out there, you know, on his own. But Kat, hi, did you have, if you wanted to comment, I could try and find you if you're still around. There you are, Kat. Do you want to, I'm going to unmute you. And if you want to talk for a minute about what you were mentioning to me online, I will let you. If I caught you off guard, I apologize. Clearly, I have caught her off guard or not successfully unmuted her. Let's take one or two more questions, then we'll thank our gentleman for showing up tonight and putting on a terrific program. Let me see here. Most of you, yeah, okay. Any other questions right now? Yes, hi, I'll put you on, there you go, just a second. You can ask two questions.
No, we just have one, I think. I have a question regarding undergrounding. With the wildfire mitigation plans having a heavy emphasis on de-energization, excuse me, and the vegetation management, but not much emphasis on the capital investments for undergrounding. What do you think it would take to change the political will? And is there any potential for getting federal funding in the infrastructure bills to come for that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been little will on undergrounding or on undergrounding, more importantly, undergrounding distributed generation. Because if you start to decentralize and then allow neighborhoods to underground and link, there's a rule called the over the fence rule. And it basically means that if you put a battery and a solar plant on your home and you're, say, at the end of a long canyon, you know, and you're in a fire area where there's PSPS and it's being de-energized all the time, you actually can't share your power over the fence with your neighbor or your neighbor's neighbor. So you can't sort of oversize your system or find ways to build undergrounded microgrids in the area because the utility controls the whole system. And you're right, they've been relying on the old model. They're just like, let's throw up steel poles instead of wood ones, and then let's shut off power. And we just hauled them into the PUC yesterday. I'm hoping the PUC enforces on them, but it's frankly been on the PUC too. I think that they haven't, you know, they killed off our undergrounding bill last year in Assembly Energy. We had that moving. It was, I want to say SB 1312, bill died. And I had a parallel bill to allow more of this distributed generation, this clean DG to be built. So I don't want a bunch more diesel coming in. To change the political will, people are going to have to be really pissed off and then connect that to the solution. So, I mean, I think everyone is sufficiently angry right now in Southern California who's had their power shut off. We had thousands of people calling into the PUC on Edison yesterday. And I think that if this clean energy package is structured the right way, especially with the vice president, who has like probably the most forward-looking piece of federal legislation on community hardening that doesn't just look at fire, but it's also the power side of things. Maybe we could get a tranche of funding carved out here. Look, the money's big, you know, but I think we can actually finance this. If the trade-off I'm looking at is to say, let the fire communities go free from the grid, give them the space to do the undergrounding and the DG they need. But in so doing, anyone who sort of wants to stay behind and demands that it be brought to them in a traditional manner over those big wires, and they want that old school power, pay more. Then pay more for that. And your rates should actually go up. It's like, it's not fair. Calabasas, again, to Compton, it's like Calabasas shouldn't have cheaper power rates or the same power rate as Compton does. It's hard to get that power to you. But so that should be, to me, the grand compromise is let those rates actually reflect the risk. But in so doing, be ready to cut the entire cord, go underground and say, push all these mountain communities off the grid. So the state's already spent $1 billion on DG and on maintenance in these areas, but we haven't linked it because the old rules, it's about utility control. And they're very reticent to have third parties and homeowners and other people like that be able to control distribution. So we're going to take another crack at the legislation this year. You guys actually, Sierra Club did a good job of helping us last year, but we got out of the Senate, got some really good things done, but so far haven't quite delivered. One area you might think about advocating is talking to the CCA. Talk to that Clean Power Alliance locally. They're the ones who are supposed to be the most responsive to our needs, and say, like, it's not just enough to try to import 100% green power from wherever. Where the power comes from matters. And like shipping it in from Arizona or Utah's fine. We want them to have clean energy too, but you know, we need this power distributed right now to be able to get through de-energization and make us agnostic, frankly, to the rest of the grid. So I'm glad you brought it up. Where do you live? Where do you guys live? Are you in the, has your power been off a bunch? Not too bad. Lucky.
You're still muted.
Anyway.
You're not, now you're unmuted.
Yeah, I bet that a lot of the club members' power has been down, but.
Okay, in any case, technology wins again in that case. So what we'd like to do is we have a question for you, John, which is really, can anyone have access to your slides? Is there any way people can view the program or share it, or they really liked it, of course, and this program is being recorded, so we'll put it on YouTube and you'll be able to see this again. But if people wanted to actually see your program, would there be a way to do that? And I also thank you, Bill. I'll call on Gary in a minute.
It would not be a problem. I work for the government, so everything I do is public domain. So anybody can have access to it. I just have to get it to them. The easiest thing, if you just want to see what I said tonight, I can make a PDF file of the talk. And that's something that will probably be small enough that it could be emailed.
Yes. If you want, we could probably
you could email me and I could make a PDF of it and send it back to whoever wants it. If there are particular slides you want, I could make those available. You just have to let me know. But just and you can get my email online. Just Google my name and USGS.
USGS does it.
Yeah.
And then let's have, if I can find you, Gary, I'll let you have the last question tonight before we thank our speakers. But I do have to find you, Gary. So let me see. My apologies. Fair number of people here to go through.
Let me just make a comment since
yeah, please.
I just wanted to say that I appreciated what Henry Stern had to say. I would consider just about everything he said to be scientifically sound, and I agree with the scientific side of it. The one thing that is really frustrating that I can see in what he's doing is the resistance that he runs up against. And I think that the resistance is almost inevitable if we're going to continue growing at the rate we're growing. I think in the last 10 years, we've added 250,000 people to the state. And there are people who have to deal with that growth. They have to put people somewhere. And so even though I agree completely that what is being said makes a lot of sense, I understand the resistance. And until we deal with how do we control population growth in a way that's going to be sustainable in a fire-prone environment? And that's something that hasn't been addressed.
Well, on that provocative thought, there he is. Sorry, Gary. I don't know why I couldn't find you. You're waving at me. Here we go. Now I'm asking you to unmute and you can ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, this question is about, while we're waiting or trying to get everybody off the grid in the fire areas, we'll still have to be using these transmission lines. Is there any way to harden and reinforce them so that they don't fail during a high wind? I mean, I know steel poles is one option, but are there other options to reinforce them so these things don't happen?
It's a good question. John and Henry?
Well, I would just offer that there are a lot of things that utility companies can do. And if you're really seriously interested in these issues, visit San Diego Gas and Electric. They have a big fire program there, and they have a really nice PowerPoint program. In fact, if you send me an email, I can send you their PowerPoint program, which describes what they're doing. There are things that could be done because not all of these incidents are just serendipity. There are maintenance deficiencies. For example, the campfire, which caused the losses in Paradise, was due to a utility pole that was 25 years overdue for replacement. And PG&E has apparently in court documents a long history of ignoring maintenance problems. So a lot can be done to make companies accountable. And I think we have gotten the attention of PG&E. We've certainly gotten the attention of San Diego Gas and Electric. They've instituted quite a few maintenance measures, and not all of it has to do with power lines being blown down. Sometimes it's just arcing that causes sparks. If you maintain the vegetation underneath the power lines, you can alter that. One of the things that's interesting is San Diego Gas and Electric was sued in 2003 and 2007, hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits. And they started a serious program to deal with their maintenance issues and plan for power shutdowns by developing this power or this weather grid system with over 200 weather stations. They took it very seriously, although I know when I visited them, they were adamant it had nothing to do with the lawsuits. It was clearly their responsibility, but they have taken it very seriously since 2007. And I can report from our fire statistics, there have been no big power line ignited fires in San Diego County in the last decade. So maybe it's serendipity, but maybe it is actually having an impact.
Thank you, John. Henry, a closing thought?
Quick wonky one for Gary. There's something called an auto recloser. So look that up. That's the race to auto reclose all the lines. So basically you can subdivide and sub-circuit it all out is a really, that's what we want to see deployed everywhere across Edison territory. But closing thought is, look, I know you've got a very diverse range of members in the club in terms of which ecologies people are living in, deep out into the, beyond the mountains of the Santa Clarita Valley, deep into the heart of Brentwood and up in the canyons of Franklin and, all the heart of urban LA and then Santa Monica Mountains. We're going to need to create a new kind of climate politics here. And it's not just the climate change politics of renewable energy, of electric vehicles. This is a new kind of politics. This resiliency is one that I think is the missing piece. When we think about climate, we think about AB 32 and SB 32. My predecessor, Fran Pavley, I helped write that legislation with her, and I'm so proud of that work. And yet the back end of it is that California is tip of the spear in this climate crisis. We in Southern California are the tip of the tip. And if we don't get some progress this year, all the electric vehicle and renewable energy progress is gone in the scope of one or two fires. And the environmental injustice of these fires is not to be underestimated. Don't let people tell you that being vigilant on wildfire risk is a precious problem or just a rural person's issue or a wooey person, because that same air is the air that the rest of the Southland's breathing. And while we're fighting COVID, people who are asthmatic and have respiratory issues are having those problems exacerbated by those wildfires. And those are working people who don't necessarily live in the hillside areas, who are maybe Black and brown communities or working poor. So don't let this issue get marginalized into something that is just an environmental one. This is a matter of justice, and I hope I'm so glad you had this forum, John. And if you all have more ideas like what Gina brought up, I got the West Hills Crest projects. Let's get specific and let's look at how to put pressure on the development scene this year in the LA region too. Don't just put all your eggs in the state legislative basket. I'm excited to work with you all to try to find those kinds of developments and how to really improve the Sierra Club's standing to get some leverage in that, to look at what Wendy Sue talked about, evac risk. Maybe a lawsuit needs to get put on the books around that issue. Maybe maybe someone needs to get checked out here. So we'll keep doing our job as best we can to keep everybody safe, but be proud of your standing on these issues. And thanks again.
We thank you, inspiring gentlemen, so much, John and Henry. Let's, even if it's only symbolic, if you can't hear us, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you again, and thanks for attending our program, and good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks a lot, John.
Be safe.